All right. Well, on that genuinely inspirational and important note, I do want to welcome all of you to the third in our series of webinars for the Climate Links community on the new USAID climate strategy. We have, I should say, my name is Genevieve Maricle. I just recently rejoined a few months ago, rejoined USAID after a few years away. And the timing, I'm serving in a senior advisor role to the chief climate officer and generally on sort of climate and environment, and had the opportunity to work on the first strategy. And it has been, I'll just say sort of on a personal note, as we get into a conversation about the strategy, it has been incredibly exciting to rejoin in this kind of moment, because as at the sort of genesis is the wrong word, because obviously it's been quite a process to get to here. But at the moment when we start implementing a genuinely whole of agency strategy that has just really been sort of defined by the good ideas of hundreds, thousands, really. So it's really an exciting time to have rejoined, and that's quickly who I am. I do want to say we have a really exciting panel here today that reflects kind of exactly what I was just kind of getting at, how genuinely whole of agency this strategy is. I'm joined today by Alex Apotsos of USAID's Bureau for Africa, who will present the strategy, as well as Amina El Abdelawi and Juan Carlos Rodriguez from our Morocco mission, who can talk about the mission's work integrating climate into its education portfolio. We want to hear your questions, and we are going to make sure that there's time at the end of this presentations to have a real opportunity for back and forth and question and answer. So we are delighted to have Samantha Wapnick from the strategy implementation team, as well as USAID's Bureau for Africa, and they will join us. She will join us to help answer questions. In terms of sort of how to do the Q&A, if you can, rather than using the chat function, because things can easily get a little bit lost there, people are writing hellos and their names and that kind of thing. If it's possible to use the Q&A function within Zoom, it's at the bottom right of the screen. You will see at the bottom bar, and you can just put in questions as you have them, and it'll store them there. And then we will sort of try and get to as many as possible over the course of the Q&A. We'll have a repository to be able to go back to. Okay, next slide, please. So just to get a little bit into why this strategy is so important. We unfortunately, all who are on this call, I'm sure, know too well at this point the impacts of climate change on all of us, but particularly the most vulnerable. As temperatures and sea levels rise, people's lives are increasingly being upended or cut short by droughts, storms, fires, and floods that will only become more destructive unless we act with urgency and ambition, that this planetary crisis demands and that we all know that we need. Climate change is threatening development progress and exacerbating global inequities, increasing water and food scarcity, the need for humanitarian assistance and displacement, and contributing to conflict. But at the same time, our response presents an opportunity to improve livelihoods. Decarbonizing industry means less air pollution that negatively impacts health. Building climate resilient infrastructure means people are safer when disaster strikes and reduces the need for costly repairs after every storm. And investing in green jobs presents an opportunity to make workforces more inclusive. Next slide, please. So one thing that has been clearly true to me as I've come back into government is just how central of a priority tackling climate change is for the US government writ large, and very much so for USAID. For AID's part, climate must be a priority because it truly does touch everything that we do across the development portfolio. And we've heard the Administrator Power say quite often that we are truly a climate agency. As you'll hear in a minute, the climate strategy responds to that urgency with as we've sort of been getting at, a truly all hands on deck approach. The sort of premise behind that is that only by taking an all hands on deck approach can we meet the most immediate needs of the climate crisis today, and also support the sort of larger scale transformation in key global systems like agriculture, energy, governance, infrastructure, and health that we know that we need in the long term. And this support does go both ways. Our Power Africa team is boosting global health efforts by targeting resources to bring stable, renewable energy to hospitals and off-grid care facilities, keeping the lights on so that these centers can tackle important and urgent needs like COVID across the continent. I know many of you have been doing great work on this for decades, and I'm genuinely excited, as the entire team is, to keep working with you through this new strategy to take on this incredibly important challenge. This can't be business as usual. USAID and the development community can make a bigger difference. We must make a bigger difference, and I genuinely believe that by working with everyone here today, we can do just that. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Alex, and he's going to get into more on what the strategy actually has in it. So next slide, and over to you, Alex.
Thanks, Genevieve. And we are super excited to have you back, having helped lead our first effort under the first strategy. So as Genevieve said, I'm Alex Apotsos. I sit in our Bureau for Africa working on climate change. And I'm here to speak to you as a representative of the very large group that put this strategy together. I think one of the unique things about this strategy relative to many of the other strategies we put together at AID previously is we really did have a whole agency approach. We had representatives from every bureau, every operating unit, from 20 different missions across our host country missions involved in the creation of this strategy. And we made a very dedicated and conscientious choice very early in the process that this wouldn't be business as usual. This wouldn't be an incremental step forward from the work that we've done in the past, but instead it would very much be this whole of agency approach where we would galvanize not just our climate change work, but pretty much everything that AID does to help both address the risks from climate to those development gains, but also ways to leverage those other development programs to help us address this very pertinent and very sort of pressing climate crisis. As Genevieve mentioned, this does build off of our earlier strategy that went from 2012 to 2018, using that and many of the lessons we learned from implementing that strategy to sort of make this large leap forward. And I also want to recognize that climate change has been something the agency has been working on for decades. And this is just the next iteration of that work, taking it to the level necessary to ensure that we address this crisis before it becomes unaddressable. And so as you'll see through the next few slides, we sort of double down on our ambition, on the way we work, and really are trying to do a shift the way we work within AID to not just sort of have incremental impacts, but really work on systems change. And so if you can move to the next slide, please, I think. So here, we just wanted to note that not only does this strategy hold of agency, but it was put together at an unprecedented speed. So we made the announcement back on Earth Day of 2001 that we were going to create a new strategy. For those of you who've worked with AID in the past know that sometimes we want to do we always want to do our due diligence, but it takes us a while to sort of craft these strategies. But we knew that this was a pressing strategy. So it's one of the quickest strategies AID's ever put together. It was put together in less than a year. But it doesn't mean that we didn't do our due diligence, didn't make it super inclusive. We held over 40 listening sessions with both internal and external stakeholders. Those are former folks who work for AID, our implementing partners, groups representing Indigenous people, youth, women, and a variety of other stakeholders to really ensure that what we were putting into our strategy really reflected where the world currently was in terms of addressing climate change through development work. We held two review sessions, one internal to USAID, where we got over 1,000 comments from across all of our operating units, and then a second one that was a public comment review period where we got over and responded to over 2,800 comments, covering a wide range of topics. And we worked diligently to ensure that the strategy reflected those comments and the input that we were receiving from all of our stakeholders. Next slide, please. So I think some of the key aspects of this strategy that really moves us forward is, as Genevieve mentioned, it's really an all hands on deck, full all of agency approach. And that was something that we conscientiously decided at the very beginning when we were first thinking about how we wanted to structure the strategy. We really had a decision to make between whether we just went with your adaptation mitigation pillars that are sort of the traditional way of approaching climate change, or really looking at a change in how we approached it. And we thought if we really want to galvanize our entire agency, if we really want to galvanize everything that we do within USAID, we really need to move away from focusing just on climate change as we used to do it, and focus on it how it needs to be done to ensure that we can have the change and affect the scale of change that we need. And so we really shifted to that, making sure that everyone within aid knows that part of their job is working on climate, even if they're a health officer, a governance officer, education officer. We also greatly expanded our emphasis on being locally led and equitable. And so as you'll see when we get to the framework on the next slide, we really pushed on not just how we think about climate change differently within the agency, but also how we work on it on the ground, and making sure that we're working more with local organizations, making sure that local voices are heard, making sure that the efforts that we're doing are both equitable and inclusive, to be able to ensure that everyone is benefiting equally and that the efforts are more sustainable. And then also making sure that when we're thinking about the changes that we're approaching, we're going to affect it at a scale necessary to help prevent the climate crisis from spiraling out of control. And so the magnitude of our ambition also went up quite a bit. If you go on to the next slide. So this slide really speaks to our ambition. So what we wanted to do is lay out 6 very high level targets for our strategy that would be sort of our North Star and our guiding light of where we're trying to get to. And it's always hard to compare previous targets to new targets. But in developing these targets, what we really said is we can't just say what we're going to do under this strategy is a slight increase over what we've done in the past strategy. So we really tried to identify those areas where we can make a big leap forward. That comes to when we're trying to reduce greenhouse gases. Our target is almost equivalent to the annual amount of greenhouse gases the US produces every year. So a huge, huge amount of greenhouse gases being emitted. We're trying to reach over 500 million people with our adaptation targets. And then we also wanted to make sure that our equity and inclusion and locally led aspects within the strategy were also captured in our targets. So we have specific targets focused on supporting government efforts through their NDCs and NAPs, as well as ensuring that critical populations are included within those larger governmental plans, as well as how we as a development organization approaches those targets. And so we really see this as a big step forward in ambition. These targets are ambitious, and they will be continue to be considered as we go forward, as we figure out how best to do various parts of our strategy. We'll also be developing interim targets to make sure that we stay on the path to reach these targets, because they are out in 2030, which can seem like a long ways away. I started when Genevieve was back in the agency in 2012. That was 8 years ago. 2020 or 10 years ago, 2022 seemed like a long time away. A lot of our projections were for 2020. And so 8 years may seem a long ways away now, but we are definitely dedicated to ensuring that we're taking the steps necessary to reach those targets. Next slide. So this is our busy slide on our framework. This was developed, again, as I said, by hundreds of folks from across the agency, having input, making sure that all of the various constituencies are included, all the various aspects that were necessary and sufficient to achieve our goal were included. And they allow us really to sort of work across all of the things that need to be done. They really help us focus on those things that are targeted. So our first strategic objective is really about the action that allows us to have big impacts right away. But then our second objective really allows us to think strategically about how we begin to change systems and the fundamental change those systems that will be necessary to put us on a low carbon growth future. And then our special objective was really recognizing that we as aid also have to look very carefully about how we do our own business, how we travel, how we procure, how we do various aspects, so that we can lead by example, both through ensuring that our programs are protected from climate risk, but also that we as an agency also aren't contributing significantly to greenhouse gas emissions. And so it really covers working quickly, working long-term, and then looking at ourselves internally. Next slide, please. So just real quickly about how we're going about implementing our strategy. As Genevieve said, this really is where the rubber hits the road. There's a lot of work to get where we're at now, but developing a strategy doesn't make change. Implementing that strategy actually does. And so we really are developing systems within USAID to implement this as a whole of agency strategy. It's not just going to be environmental officers or folks who have climate change in their title. It really will be everyone within the agency working to achieve these objectives. And that only through that process will we be able to sort of achieve the high level of ambition set out in our targets. And we'll be working with our partners in Congress, with our implementing partners, with our host country partners in country to really figure out how best to do these activities, how best to integrate locally led concepts better into our implementation. And so we're developing guidance, we're developing how-to notes, we're developing all of sort of the internal structures within the agency that are necessary to do this. And that is, it can be a heavier lift than one might think, to really reorient the entire agency to focus on climate as a part of our overall objectives. And of course, we'll be in constant contact with our partners as we do this, as we're learning, as we continue to adapt over the next 5 to 8 years to figure out how best to put this strategy into practice to affect the size and scale of change that we want to see. And so I'm going to pause there. I could talk forever on the strategy, having spent the last year of my life on it, but I really think the most interesting aspect is to hear from our missions about what they're doing and how they're seeing this affecting their work. And so I'm handing off to Juan Carlos and Amina to talk about their work in Morocco. Over.
Thanks a lot for that handover. Can we click to the next slide? Thanks so much. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Good morning. My name is Juan Carlos Rodriguez. I'm very pleased to be here. Thanks for having us. I'm the director of an office called General Development Office here in USAID Morocco. And my wonderful colleague, Amina, you'll hear from in a minute, is joining me as well. So let's just, since we are still in this nice honeymoon period of the strategy, can we start with a direct quote as it relates to education? Because that's the focus of our presentation today. So up at the top, climate change poses challenges to education infrastructure and learning outcomes. It impacts marginalized populations disproportionately. Strong education systems can implement proactive measures to reduce climate shocks and stressors. Education for girls and young women in particular advances their empowerment, fosters their climate leadership, and pro-environmental decision-making. That's powerful to us on our team, and you'll understand a little bit more in a few minutes. So first of all, huge congratulations to the USAID leadership group, folks on this call, colleagues, partners, especially for their contributions to a new finalized climate strategy. Given the urgency, as we heard and saw in the video and know ourselves, the urgency of climate change in all the countries where we work and live, and the challenge of finding strategic coherence for the agency, this is really no small achievement. And to do it in the time frame we did it is quite impressive. I'm proud to say that our mission was engaged in the strategy development process from the get-go via the Mission Advisory Group. We really appreciate that field inclusive approach through surveys, focus groups, retreats, etc. But most importantly, that engagement actually allowed us to, as we like to say a lot around here in this mission, have the very first strategy-aligned education program designed in the agency. There might be competition out there, but we are so closely aligned in terms of when we launched our own design process and when the strategy kicked off as well. And we're wrapping up that design, and Amina will touch on that. In a few short slides, we'll walk you through our mission's framing with the new strategy, our past work on this, and on the design work that's been happening in parallel. We hope you find it both validating and inspiring. Next slide, please. So as I highlighted earlier, the alignment of the strategy development program with a rigorous and intense education flagship design allowed us to both learn from what we've been doing in partnership with the climate progressive Moroccan government in recent years without a strategic mandate, and what more can be done under the new strategic umbrella that is in place now. Like in many countries, the risk to learning outcomes and education systems writ large, communities, educators, learners, administrators, government staff, etc., is clear. School closures, disruptions to attendance and learning efficiency, shifting of resource priorities within a household during times of climate shock and migration, disproportionate impacts on marginalized populations. These are all real in Morocco, as in most of the countries where you all work as well. And we're fortunate here that the government of Morocco is actively working to mitigate these risks. A key part of the education climate change integration is the recognition that climate change shocks impact learning in the short and medium term, but that education programming is also a tool to mitigate the impacts of climate change and drive transformational change. Sometimes that's in the long term, and we'll talk about that a little bit too. The impacts are often down the road as we see these young people grow and turn their awareness into advocacy and leadership. Personally, I always think about my 7 and 9-year-old daughters learning about climate change, coming home, talking about that in school right now. I wasn't doing that when I was a kid. And I think about the kind of advocates and climate activists they'll be when they're 17 or 19 years old. To me, that's a huge, big change for the future, and it's inspiring. Next slide, please. Morocco is one of the countries most affected by climate change. Morocco's emissions are relatively low. However, emissions and energy consumption have been increasing considerably in recent decades. Morocco is currently experiencing its worst drought in 30 years, talking about climate shocks and its impact on education. Climate change, in terms of climate change impacts, 42% of Moroccan coastlines are at high risk of erosion and floods by 2030. Declining water resources and a decrease in average precipitation across the country. Population growth will put additional pressures on water resources. However, at the same time, Morocco's nationally determined contributions are some of the most progressive in the world. And that's a big positive in trying to implement a strategy here. So in the context of these challenges and opportunities, when we talk about the implementation of this climate change strategy, here's the question. What does it take for a mission and its partners to implement strategic priorities like the ones outlined in this strategy? As a mission team, we suggest that it takes 3 things primarily: the mandate, i.e. the strategy, sometimes, resources, human resources, time, funding, and capacity to partner with, support, and implement across stakeholders. We think it's a really good news story that prior to the mandate, the strategy that just launched, our team, staff, and partners were able to follow the lead of a progressive Ministry of Education on this front. And during the strategy development process, we were able to follow along, contribute as a mission team, and ensure alignment of new programs to this document. Primary areas of focus include these 2 flagged climate action strategies within education: integrate climate themes in pre-primary, basic, and higher education, and climate education teacher training and teacher materials, and improved environmental practices and attitudes in their extracurricular activities or project-based learning. For me, for us, this is a story about meeting a government where they are, so they can lead us when we're not in a position to lead ourselves, how we can build off of that momentum when our priorities do align, and ultimately how a strategy will validate and further strengthen our commitment to climate change integration within our education portfolios. Now over to our superstar education team lead, Amina, to tell you a bit about what is happening within the portfolio, current and future. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Juan Carlos, and very honored to be presenting in this meeting. So, as you noted, global climate change and its impact on people and resources pose serious challenges, and educating future generation about the cause and effects of global climate change is very imperative and crucial. Given this, our education portfolio, which we believe is a climate portfolio, considers climate change an important cross-cutting area to incorporate from activity design into the implementation. So here we will highlight the example of the National Program of Reading, what we are going to refer to as NPR, our education flagship program that started in 2017 when no climate change mandate or the new climate change strategy was developed. And the main objective of the NPR program is to expand USAID's Morocco's effort in supporting the Ministry of Education to develop a new Arabic curricula from grade 1 to 6 based on innovative pedagogical approaches and integration of equity and inclusion. In this program, the key areas for climate change effort and integration are the integration of climate change education across the Arabic curricula at all levels, grade 1 to 6, and encouraging our government partners to integrate it at the other subject areas. In addition, the program helped tailor climate change content and encourage activities such as environmental conversation, climate project-based learning, and extracurricular activities through environmental clubs. And the project-based learning is a new approach which focused mostly on projects supporting wildlife, agriculture, energy, and transportation among others. And the third area is strengthening the teacher's capacity to understand and deliver climate change content and carry on lessons plans using their professional judgment. And the project worked on dedicated material to support climate change learning activities, such as provision of teachers' resources guides, which incorporated and highlighted the importance of the climate change theme. We also introduced of supplementary reading materials, guided, inspired, and empowered students to contribute to the development of their communities. In addition, the NPR team provided recommendations to authors and textbook publishers on how to integrate curriculum, climate change education in the textbooks that they write and they publish. And we talked earlier about the learning and extracurricular activities through the environmental clubs and climate change clubs. Next slide, please. Thank you. The second example of our education programming is the Bridge to Middle School, which is fortunately being designed while the climate change mandate and the new climate change strategy is being developed. This is a new project which is still under procurement, which seeks to partner with the Ministry of Education and other stakeholders, being it from the private sector and from the NGOs and communities, to improve the learning outcomes in Arabic, English, and STEM subjects from grade 4 to 9 in ways that impact learning outcomes and support a child's transition from upper primary to middle school. And the new curriculum and material that will be developed and tested are planned to scale up to the entire student population of upper primary and middle schools in Morocco. So given the importance of the climate change, the project integrated this component at an early phase of the design and devoted a significant time during the project co-creation for a session with the Ministry of Education and stakeholders to talk about how the partners will integrate climate change strategy, its areas into this new flagship program. And in terms of the curricula, the project will develop a new curricula at upper primary and middle school, which integrate concepts from earth, life, physical science, as well as the most current data on climate systems. This will help students understand the phenomenon of climate change, the justification for this phenomenon, and why these phenomena are both scientifically and socially important. Equally important is strengthening teachers' capacity to understand and deliver climate change content using new teaching and learning material. And finally, the STEM, which is, science, technology, engineering, and math, is an important area of intervention of our Bridge to Middle School program and is intended to use the most current data on climate change. And with that, I hand it over to Juan Carlos. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Amina. Thanks so much, not just for this, but for all your work on this. We just wanted to put out a couple considerations for the group. It's not necessarily to answer now, but we wanted to throw out first, how do we drive towards that mandate, resources, capacity trifecta that we mentioned earlier, effectively engaging with our partners and key stakeholders. We want to hear from partners on these sorts of things, both in our countries, but also in DC, of course. And then secondly, in a context of multiple and competing strategic priorities, how do we recognize and support not just sectoral integration, like we were talking about here in education, climate integration, but also priorities, but strategic integration. One example is climate change and localization, which is also a big priority for us. So when we think about how to do this in a resource-constrained environment, how do we think about doing climate change integration, and more advanced localization efforts. Things like that are important when we think about how to get the most efficient use of our resources. And with that, I'll turn it back to the host. Over.
Thank you so much. Thank you both for that genuinely, great presentation, and to Alex as well. I think, we are obviously, our missions are our champions in the field, and it's important to recognize that many of them have been basically tackling these issues and the climate crisis for decades. And I think one thing that's so exciting about the presentation that we just saw is that there really are, the way that the strategy is built to genuinely inspire systems change across all of the different sort of areas in which we work really does come up with fascinating and creative sort of solutions that are not just in sort of buckets that our brains have been in for quite, for so long. So it is very exciting to see this stuff really playing out in real life. The strategy was clearly designed, as you've heard, to give missions the tools and support they need to really ramp up impact. And so now with this, I want to make sure that we have a chance to get to all of your questions. If you haven't already done so, please do put any questions that you have in that Q&A portion. As you may have seen, if you've clicked on that, there have been, the team has been sort of actively answering questions in written form, but we do have a few minutes at least to get into a bit of a discussion about them. So I think what I'd love to do first is turn to the first question that we got in, and I will read that out and then actually just open it up. Juan Carlos has actually already answered this in a really helpful way, but because it is a question that sort of crosses some of the key sort of implementation pieces, I do want to just open it up to the group. So the question was, many USAID grants have short timeframes, while climate solutions, especially those that are locally led and equitable, will require considerable flexibility and extended project lengths. Can you speak about how these aspects are addressed in the new strategy? So for this one, I might actually just open it up to the group. With the caveat that maybe it makes sense, Alex, to turn to you first to talk about it in the context of the sort of strategy objectives, and then maybe, Samantha, Juan Carlos, Amina, you can come in on any other piece of that you may want to voice here.
Thanks, Genevieve. And I'll talk first at the sort of the 30,000 foot level. I think that was a very very large point when we were thinking about developing the strategy, and which is why it's actually an 8-year strategy instead of a 5-year strategy. We wanted to make sure that longer term considerations was there. I also think that the part of the reason we structured our objectives the way we did was to try to allow missions to engage more in that type of long-term programming where they wouldn't need immediate results, which is what our entire second of strategic objective about is sort of changing systems and changing the way we work. And so while it doesn't speak directly to the implementation flexibility, which I think Juan Carlos and Samantha can speak to, I think the idea of opening up the way we approach climate change and understanding that often our implementing time scales aren't in line with the crisis time scales. We wrote this strategy with that in mind to enable that type of thinking to occur under it. And then now that how exactly that will be implemented is being worked out. And so I'll hand over to Samantha and then Juan Carlos. Over.
Hi all, sorry, I'm just having a little trouble with my camera here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you great.
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's a really important question, and it's definitely one that's front and center for those of us working in the field context as well. And I completely agree with Juan Carlos's perspective that we have more flexibility than we sometimes use. And one of the things that we're seeing is a trend toward trying to maximize our flexibility, maximize adaptive management. And you can see that also flagged in the strategy roadmap to implementation. And we are working with some of the procurement colleagues here at USAID to explore further opportunities to maximize the flexibility, build in more of the refine and implement approach, co-creation, et cetera. And contingency planning is also an area that is showing a lot of promise for programming in very climate sensitive programs and areas and regions. Juan Carlos, did you also want to add to that?
Yeah, and I'll kind of be the less diplomatic one, maybe, just to say that, I mean, there's no doubt we're going to get questions about impact and outcomes faster than we are able to achieve them. I mean, this is a agency-wide strategy, and it's a political priority for our government. So there will be questions coming at us quickly. But at the same time, I think when you look at something like the education program that Amina manages and is designing, we have to be realistic in what we say are good impacts and outcomes of programs like that. You know, a 6, 7, 8, 9-year-old kid that's getting climate themed education curriculum or lessons, you know, that is a long-term impact to that, and we are banking on that. And I think we are banking on success looking like every single student in Morocco is going to get some aspects of climate change and climate crisis in their curriculum. We know that's a good thing for the future. So I think in terms of how we manage expectations, we do that with our partners. I think the more collaboration, the friendlier the dynamic is and problem solving together, the more we can figure things out in terms of having realistic expectations. And of course, that's a huge component of the localization agenda, which we are thrilled that the climate change strategy or the climate strategy has incorporated that so deeply in it. It gives us leverage when we talk about what those real expectations should be. Over.
Thank you so much. So I know we have, I'm very appreciative to all for the great questions that are coming in. With only 3 minutes left, we won't be able to answer all of them, but we will give you, well, come back to that in a second. There will be chances to continue engaging, but we do want to get into a few. So I will just try and very quickly address the first question about in the open questions about the public finance sort of arena. If my read of the question is right, I think the question is asking if the how this strategy and the work that we're talking about here sort of fits into the public finance commitment made back in Copenhagen to the $100 billion per year from developed countries. And I just would say that, you know, everything that we're sort of talking about here certainly, you know, is fueled by the sort of broader public budget that we are trying to secure for all of this kind of work. I mean, I think one thing that's really powerful about this strategy is that it does truly think about sort of systems change across every area. And so a lot of that is not going to, you know, it is going to come from engaging people, you know, in the entirety of the development portfolio. But a big part of this is also about sort of trying to fight for as much public budget as we can get for sort of climate work. And we are absolutely doing that. And all of that will feed into the 100 billion. But I think one thing that is just sort of very important to call out in one of the slides that Alex presented was that commitment among the sort of very ambitious goals to mobilizing $150 billion of private sector finance and additional finance beyond that sort of public, so that we really are able to drive the scale of commitment that is required to make these kinds of true transformations. It is very clear the global community is nowhere near the amount that where we need to be. And so trying to think creatively and use the sort of the capacity of all kinds that we have to get as much more as possible directed towards these kinds of programs is clearly our goal. And we're working very actively on a roadmap and all of these kinds of things to getting that $150 billion mobilized. So it's I hope I got at your question, but I think that it will continue to be a huge priority for us to drive both the public and private finance towards these kinds of projects. So that's just a very quick answer on that. Obviously happy to engage more if that didn't quite get at what you were looking for. I want to quickly open the question that was to the Morocco team. Did you have the strategy in mind when you were putting together this education program? And then sort of how do you see the education program and education in general fitting into the new strategy?
Yeah, Amina, do you want me to jump in or do you want to go?
Yes, please go ahead, and I'll just add a few comments once you finish. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. I was in the process of responding, but yeah, I mean, I made the comment earlier that, when we don't have the mandate ourselves internally, when we don't have a strategy on climate, then Amina and the team here were able to work under the leadership of the government of Morocco, and particularly the Ministry of Education, because they did have a plan, they did have a strategy, they did have commitments. So that is how this work was happening with no climate strategy in place. Then as we designed the follow-on, we were able to bolster a little bit more and have, quite honestly, more credibility, because we were in the process of designing a new strategy. So now we have an intersection of USAID's new climate strategy and the government of Morocco's own commitments and priorities that align very nicely. So we were able to design the new program as the strategy development was unfolding. We knew what was coming. We were inputting from what our own experiences were. But we were fortunate to have leadership on climate in the country where we worked when we weren't seeing it ourselves internally. So I think that's where I'll leave it. Amina, did you want to add?
Yeah, thank you, JC. And I just wanted to say that we aligned our priorities with the Ministry of Education and USAID's one in terms of the importance of climate change. There has been a section because we were working on the curricula that highlighted prominently the importance of the climate change, I mean, including environmental sections. But this has happened with our own resources. I mean, we adapted, shifted content to reflect this. And we didn't have, I mean, the mandate at that time, and we didn't have the resources that we are still lacking. But we managed to align the agendas, use the resources, and look for opportunities on how to develop ourselves in terms of the professional development to be able to reflect those important priorities on our education portfolio. And by the way, I've mentioned two examples from basic education, but this is also to mention that we are having examples from higher education that reflects that integration of climate change in the higher education portfolio as well. Thank you, and over.
All right, thank you so much. I am very disappointed to have to do this because we do have some great questions in the chat still open, and I think we are all eager to continue talking and have this conversation and responses to these kinds of questions continue. So I do just want to say, if you do have outstanding questions, you can literally cut and paste them and put them in or if you think of them after the fact, that's okay too. Please do email us at team@climatelinks.org, and we can continue this conversation. But obviously, in the implementation of this strategy, there's going to be a lot more conversations to come. I do want to plug that Climate Links is starting a monthly climate topics webinar series that will be collaborative. In the registration links for this same webinar, you can propose topics or let us know by email. And then I do just really, now that I'm 3 minutes over in this moderation, I do just want to thank so much our panel for just the fantastic insights and inspiration for what this can look like. And just want to thank all of you for coming. So let's go forward and meet this moment together. Thank you so much.
Thank you.